All right. So this week we get to end things on a crit think. I don't know if I want to say it that way every single
I
time.
don't think you want to say it that way this time.
Crit think. Uh, we're going to have a crit think about hot coffee. No, what we're going to do is we're going to have a crit think about dueling campaigns. And so the question that I am
Ding
posing...
ding 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 ding
dueling
ding.
banjo campaigns. Yeah, we'll just do a musical RPG and that will work.
Space Pirates the musical?
Yes, that is dueling banjo campaigns. What the question is at the start here for Crit Think is, can you make a dueling campaign? That's the basic.
You just have duels the entire time.
I pr-
One-on-one duels.
Okay, maybe I need to explain that a little bit better.
Yes, you do.
What I'm talking about, and I'm actually glad I will try to leave a link to Helicity had made a little Twitter thread about what to do when your party is a little too high power, and one of the things he was talking about was the idea that you could actually create, as like the GM, another party that might have similar goals and is in somewhat of an adversarial relationship to your party. And I remembered, oh yeah, that reminds me of something I was really looking forward to talking about, the idea of whether you could do a thing where you actually had not really a party, but you had two separate parties of like two different kinds, two sets of players essentially, that are both looking to achieve the same basic goal. And so now they are in a position where they have to compete against each other in order to achieve that goal before the other team does. Kind of making more of a PvP version, or
They're playing Survivor, the RPG.
it's kind of like Survivor the RPG, yeah. And it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be fun to see who decides to be what character.
Yeah, and who falls in the fire?
Who falls in the fire and who decides to just be naked all the time. It's going to be hilarious.
Most of them.
Most of them.
Because we talked about this. They don't wear clothes.
No, you don't wear clothes. Yeah, exactly. Clothing is optional in all RPGs. But I'm trying to figure out how you actually set this up. If we were going to do a dueling campaign, can that work? How will I set this up? How do we determine what the teams are going to be? And who's going to be in them?
There's a lot of different factors that go in there, so I think you would need to break it down into each of those separately.
Okay.
For instance, who is in it would depend on people's schedules, for that sense.
Right.
Like who's available now, who's available then, kind of deal.
Sure.
That one's more logistics than game.
Okay. Are you thinking, well, I mean, what might help with the scheduling, too, in that case, is if you are literally just talking to one team at one point and then another team at another point.
Yeah. I would not set it up so you're going back and forth between two teams in one session. If you're going to do that, I would do it even possibly with two GMs, one for each group, if you wanted to do that.
Yeah.
But I would set it up so it's one session is one group and another session is the other group.
Right. I can totally see a red versus blue for this. That would be just absolutely amazing. I kind of need to see that. But yeah, a 2 GM system I can see as long as the GMs are conferring at some point, taking notes about where their players are and
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm also thinking about, like, is it going to really matter what classes the different characters are going to play in order for it to be I mean, technically, if it's a balanced system where all the characters are fairly well balanced, it's not going to
matter. Unless they're going to be fighting each other,
yeah,
I don't think it matters what classes they're going to have unless it's campaign specific to some goal that requires you needing a specific class.
You may need to set up a wide variety of challenges that are not just necessarily one kind of combat scenario. Like if it's puzzles, or if it's reading ancient languages, or diplomatic options.
Yes and no. I
Three
mean,
barbarians walk into a bar, everything gets
that's something
smashed.
for the party to overcome, though, and for you to tailor to being the party being able to do those things.
Okay.
So I don't think you really need to be like, all right, we need to actually have a balanced party. It just needs to be okay, so if you guys are all barbarians, I
Yeah.
guess I should make it so it's capable of being solved by barbarians.
Right. Okay. Excellent. By smashing it.
Sure.
Yeah.
It just, you kind of can tweak what you're doing, or you're designing these things as you do them
Sure.
to keep your party in mind.
Okay. All right. So we can customize that experience for the different players. But now, if we're doing a dueling campaign, okay, and you have those two GMs, do we have to give the same challenges to? Yeah, exactly. Dueling banjo. If we're doing that, though, do we have to give the same challenges to both parties?
No. For the first reason I say no, is because the parties might not be in the same location.
True.
So they won't necessarily come into the same challenges if they're nowhere near each other. That would kind of not make sense unless they're doing the exact same path and hitting the exact same notes, and the DMs are just different. And they're just doing the same thing, but that's just like playing a module with two different campaigns at that
Sure.
point.
Sure.
I assume the parties would be in different locations having different things happen to them. However,
That might
so
also depend on what the characters decide to do. Like, what
Right.
happens if the one party and the other party take the same fork in the road? Or take the forks that
the way I personally envision it is that you've got the two parties going for the same or similar goal, even if for different reasons.
Yeah.
Say there's a treasure chest that they want to get to that's got a relic in it, but one of them's coming from one side of a cave and the other's coming from the other side of the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they've got different challenges getting there from different locations and along the way.
Got it.
But the other thing is maybe they also don't have the same point in time.
Oh, yeah.
As I think I've mentioned before, time shenanigans are really fun.
Time
in
crimes.
Like we were talking before, I've had one party in a campaign do things that affect the game world for later time periods of that game world.
Oh,
And then the parties that took place in later periods or earlier periods could affect or were affected by what happened.
Yeah. I just kept thinking to myself, when you were talking about time, that idea that it would be really interesting if you had those dueling campaigns, but you had the one party that was doing things like 1 year ahead of the other party. And so they start, and whatever they do ends up being very much what the fallout is that the next party has to deal with. That they've set the town on fire. Year later, the next party gets there, the town's
burned down, yeah.
Exactly.
And I think that's really fun because then it's like you can. The downside to that is the party that comes in afterwards is just dealing with the aftermath of this.
Right.
So, especially if there's a time lapse,
Yeah.
there's nothing they're going to have to be able to do really unless you deal with time travel shenanigans.
Sure.
There's nothing they're going to be able to do to counteract that beforehand.
But here's the thought. If you're looking long game, this is what I'm thinking. That first party, the one that came before, they're on a quest, right? And you assume that, like, you're kind of setting it up that at the end of this quest, the heroes end up doing essentially a bad thing that's probably going to end up ruining a lot of stuff. And essentially, your heroes then become the villains that the group behind them now has to stop.
Okay, but then it's, again, that doesn't necessarily become dueling campaigns. That's one campaign leading up into the events that the other campaign after it has to clean up.
Right.
So I would instead, for me, time shenanigans being as they are, if I wanted to have that as a time differential, I would say there are points in time they could go back and swap and go back or forward to the period in time
Mm.
with each other
Okay.
and deal with events as they happen, for instance.
Okay.
Um,
The other way, if you wanted to do that, just because time could be a little bit of an odd factor if you're trying to keep things a little bit balanced, because one is always going to have like the advantage of being ahead of stuff in some ways, but you could do dimensional as well,
sure.
so that they're not really um, they're diverging at a certain point, and then you see what happens with that campaign in two very different directions,
Sure.
and then see what the resolution is. But by the time you get back to the resolution, the parties essentially kind of meet. You've kind of created a metric at the end where it feeds together, and those dimensions cross back over into each other. That's also an interesting idea. If you wanted to keep them separated. But personally, I don't really mind the idea of just having the one world in the same time frame, have those two parties going along, and if it turns out when the GMs are convening, it's like, oh, I guess my folks are in the same town your folks are at. We might just have to do a joint session all together.
Right. I was
And,
gonna say that's the
yeah,
other thing you can always do. Of course, is that
yeah,
type of game,
and then
and
just
I
5
think that
versus
can be
5.
really fun, because you could set the parties up either as not knowing each other at all in the beginning, and they just happenstance, and then they can either deal with each other, and it could be the end of one campaign, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
as in hero, anti-hero, or two opposing parties fighting, and see who comes out victorious if that's the end of the campaign.
Mm.
Or you could do it in a way that they start out as rivals, kind of like the beginning of a Pokemon game. Starts you out facing this person who is now your rival, and it's not your enemy. You're not trying to kill each other, but you're competing.
Yeah.
So a competition of that sort, where you're like, all right, well, we're gonna have a competition. Like maybe you set it up where it's like the king is granting land
Sure.
to the mightiest adventurers who can bring back relics.
Right.
So now you're scavenging for these like several unknown like lost relics that are rumored to be in a bunch of different locations. So it's like, all right, where do you want to go first? Where do you want to go first? You branch out, you start in different areas, you go to different ones, and you're eventually going to meet up at some point. Or you could maybe send people off, set traps for the other party to slow them down, stuff
Yeah.
like that. Um, then maybe you both head for the same relic at the same time, and you're gonna have to go there and then fight for it if you meet up, or maybe you see one of the other parties leaving it with the relic, so you steal it from them.
Sure.
All that sort of stuff. You could do something like
Good
that.
times. Yeah.
Good times, great times.
Oh yeah.
Create tension through the parties being duplicitous with each other.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Now, if you are able to kind of set that up with the GMs too, it would be interesting to see if you almost tempt the parties to go like really against each other, um, and to try and undermine their efforts in some ways, or snatch the only problem I can see though is that if you do have a relationship where they might be interacting, or the game world is more dynamic and interacting with each other, one party is technically always going to have an advantage if they're the ones having the session first before the other one.
Aside from joint sessions, maybe.
Possibly.
I don't see it as a huge problem if you do it right. I think the biggest issue is making sure that both sides are having fun.
Oh yeah. In games,
Because
we
if
don't do
suddenly
that.
players don't typically like when you steal objects from them, for instance.
No.
So them finding out that the other party jacked their stuff 2 sessions later, finding out 5 towns away,
Oh
they're
yeah.
not gonna be happy.
You're gonna have one party that actively wants to destroy the other party because they're
Yeah.
angry. They're just
So it'll be fun as long as you can make that balance, and as long as they don't take things personally.
sure.
It's not an attack on the players themselves. It's the characters doing what they would do and interacting with the other party as adversaries and rivals and trying to one-up them.
Sure. Okay, that's fair. Yeah, I'm trying to think what the best solution to this would be. I mean, in order to just not step over each other, that's like, that's all I'm thinking. It's like if you look at tic-tac-toe, there's technically a whole thing where whoever goes first is technically always going to win. Like even in chess, they have always said like the person who goes first is almost always going to win the game, assuming that you're on similar like knowledge levels, because you have just made the first move. So the game is now essentially in your hands from the very beginning. And if you are of a similar level of skill, you are probably going to win. So if you're not doing sessions all in one go, everyone's going to have. I mean, even in battles in the game, the person who has the highest initiative is probably going to be, in some ways, having the real advantage, because you're going to try to kill as many monsters as you possibly can before they can even take the opportunity to to come back and fight. Now, your way of doing combat, though, might actually work for that. Like if you had a session, because your way of doing combat was basically like the enemies can still act upon you because everything's
Oh yeah,
happening at once.
I would still do that if it's players versus player combat,
Oh,
because
sure.
then you're not like, oh, I killed you in one hit, and they're like, so I get to do nothing. It's like, yeah, you get to do nothing. You're dead. Sorry, bye.
Yeah.
No, you'd still be like, yeah, you can do stuff, and other players can do stuff, and you're not downed until the end of that round of combat.
Right. Then the other thing that I'm thinking is, you have the one group that meets and you have the other group that meets, but during those sessions, the one-to-one sessions, whatever the other team has done does not really come into play at all. That's not really necessary. When the next sessions come around, then you have kind of notes from the other GM about what happened in their campaign. So now if something happens, you can reference it if it's something pertinent to what your people are doing.
Right.
But it wouldn't just be like, oh, you did it in this session, and then over here, okay, there was a swarm of crabs apparently next to your camp. It was Crabageddon, and
Crabageddon.
yeah, Crabageddon happened. Sorry. And now you have no lobster rolls. It's all crabs all the time. You'd have
Only
to.
crabs.
It's only crabs. That is like OnlyFans, but for fishermen. Anyway, the point is, the point is, as long as you kept it to like the actions or the effect of the cause doesn't take place until the next grouping of sessions instead of the one after the next after the next, you wouldn't have that step over.
Right.
Yeah. So you can have that combat as well, just like that. And even when they get to the crystal, if one team gets to like the magical crystal thing or whatever your objective is, before we resolve that, you take into account what the other team does. And if they get there at in their same session, now we have a joint session and you've both made it essentially at the same time.
Right. And as a games master, you can always find ways to slow down or speed up your party without them really knowing about it.
That's right. There was a magical
So that
shortcut, you just didn't know about it.
So if you want to say have that climactic, oh, both of you are going for that last relic at the same time. If you want to have that type of climactic tension building struggle right there between the two powers, you can cause that to happen.
Oh yeah, there just happened to be a hyper loop on your route.
Or monsters attack the other party.
Oh yeah,
So they have to rest and recuperate.
Yep, they have to slow down. Yeah.
Or rocks fell in their path.
You happen to be near a train station. That's also a possibility.
And you couldn't, and you tried really hard to run into the 9 3/4 platform, but you just bonked your head on the wall and fell over.
Yep, it's too bad, folks.
You're not a wizard. You're just Harry.
Yes, exactly. You're not. and you got on the Hogwarts Express. Sorry. I'm feeling a little Hagrid myself, so we should probably finish this up. So I guess the question that we probably pose to people, or at least the question I'd like to pose to people, is it better to have a dueling campaign of adversaries or allies? If we have two opposing parties that are trying to do cooperative things in different places, or if they are actively trying to work against each other.
The other side of that question could also be, if you are going to have dueling parties or dueling campaigns with two different parties in the same world at different times, how would you best go about that? What are ways you might try to pull that off that could be interesting? That's our crit think for you.
Yeah, I'll shorten it a little bit just to, how would you do a dueling campaign? That's probably the something I can fit in the little bar in the top.
How do you duel?
How do you duel? Yeah, there you go.
It's like, how do you do? How do you duel?
Exactly. Okay, great.